Hello. Today I would like to answer a couple of members' questions in the usual Q&A format. They both relate to the Tudor period, and the first one of them, so they make a nice pair. And the first one of them comes, well, from across the Atlantic, from Todd Torkelson, who writes as follows. I love, this is Todd of course, being part of this community that you've started. As an American, he says, I hear a lot about Arthur Tudor was the heir and the future Henry VIII, Prince Henry, Duke of York, was just the spare. Then he goes on, why wasn't the spare valued just as much since life was so fragile at the time? Why wasn't Henry given the same education and training growing up as Arthur? And then a lovely remark, Todd, as a computer guy, I know the critical importance of backups. Do I not? Gesturing in the direction of the looming screen. But of course, their world isn't our world. There are different values. And the logic of this question is a very 20th century logic. It's interestingly the logic that was applied by my own grandparents to my mother. My mother, I'm in the middle of my autobiography at the moment, so I'm very aware of these kind of things, of these issues of upbringing, royal or otherwise. My mother was one of 3 children. They were very close to each other. 3 children were born within 2 years, which you can just about do. My mother was the eldest. She was by far the brightest. She was outstandingly able at school. And in those days, she's born in 1907, you left school at 13 unless that was the end of state-sponsored education. Beyond that point, you had to pay fees. And there was great pressure from the staff at my mother's school, from her headmaster in particular, that she should be allowed to continue at school, that she should go on to teacher training college, and so on. And my grandparents thought about it very hard, but they decided, and this is Todd's point in a sense, they had to treat their 3 children equally. So, as they couldn't afford to send all 3 of them to college, none of them were sent to college, despite the fact that my mother was very much the most talented. Equity versus recognition of talent is a problem that's increasingly common in today's woke world. The Tudors, of course, weren't woke, and they didn't believe in equality. And this is the fundamental point, Todd, we've got to grasp about royal upbringing, or indeed about the upbringing of the whole of the upper class. They are an aristocratic society, so they value precedence, order, priority within families. They value tradition. They value precedent, in other words, the earlier way of doing things. I mean, within the royal family now, you have a strict hierarchy as one of one rank curtsies or bows to another of the higher one. Within a family, within people who, well, in most ways have fairly normal, loving relations, but there's a recognition of that hierarchy. And of course, there is the recognition of who is the heir and who is the spare, still there. But let's go back to the Tudors. Why were Henry and Arthur treated so differently? I think the short answer is for the simple reason that the children of Edward IV, who also had 2 sons, were treated very differently also. Henry VII, remember, Henry Earl of Richmond, becomes king after that very unexpected victory. I think unexpected by everybody else apart from himself, that unexpected victory at Bosworth. Henry VII is profoundly aware, on the one hand, of his own sense of destiny, this thing that, as we'll see, I will explore, characterises all the Tudors, this extraordinary sense that they literally are there by a divine right, that they, as we again would say, you have that sense of that destiny, that right. The last thing any of them suffer from is an imposter syndrome. And yet, of course, fundamentally, Henry VII was an imposter, or at least he was a usurper. I mean, he had, again, minimal hereditary right to the throne. So he's very aware of how to legitimate himself, how to invoke ideas of precedence, of the accepted way of doing things. And he decides the accepted way of bringing up royal children is the way in which they had been brought up by the last legitimate, the last king, who was recognised as a legitimate king, Richard III, of course, being described as king in deed but not in right, whereas his elder brother, Edward IV, is acknowledged as king, and he, as I said, had two sons. The eldest son, Prince Edward, born whilst his father has been driven into exile and his mother had taken refuge within the sanctuary at Westminster in 1470-71 during what we call the readaptation crisis, when Henry VI is briefly brought back as a kind of puppet king. Anyway, the prince is born within sanctuary. His father comes back, triumphantly seizes the throne, and then is given this particular upbringing. And again, what Edward is doing, he, in other words, Prince Edward, the son of Edward IV, is the first to be sent off to Ludlow, to take over as head of a council in the Marches of Wales and to learn to develop his skills as a ruler by learning on the job, learning how to rule England by being as a youth governor of Wales, with, of course, assistance, mainly from the family of his mother, mainly from the Woodville family. Why again Ludlow? There is no historic royal tradition of being sent to Ludlow. It is that Edward himself inherits Ludlow in his capacity as Earl of March. He descends on one side from the royal house, on the other side from the Mortimer family. He has this very, very powerful streak of Welsh Marcher blood. And Ludlow had been the great castle of the Mortimers, and what Edward does, he rebuilds it extensively, and he turns it into the centre of a devolved, on the one hand, a devolved administration in the Marches of Wales, that territory of great Marcher lords who had supplied so many of the armies of retainers of the Wars of the Roses, things like the Herberts at Raglan Castle, magnificent Raglan Castle and so on. He turns it into the centre of this devolved administration on the one hand, and a kind of princely, not a kind of, princely palace for his son on the other, and he sets up a highly formalised pattern of training, both in scholarship and in the arts of knighthood, of war, of music, and all the rest of it. We have very detailed instructions for the household which is set up for Prince Edward. We also have evidence of Prince Edward kicking against the pricks, being as you would expect from his father and his mother, Elizabeth Woodville, a powerful and self-willed boy, and taking quite a lot of effort, actually, to keep him under control. So it's Edward who sets the precedent of sending the eldest son off to Ludlow to be formally trained as Prince of Wales by being the head of a council in the Marches of Wales that rules over the Marches and the Principality of Wales. So that's the precedent. There's also the precedent of how you treat the second son, the younger Richard, Duke of York, who is the second son of Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville. And here again, he is kept at home with his mother, with Elizabeth Woodville. So I think, in one sense, it's a recognition of a male-female role. The royal children are the royal nursery at court is a dependency of the Queen's household. Elizabeth Woodville is a powerful and politically active queen. It's also clear she's a concerned and involved parent. And so giving the second son to her is a recognition of her independent role. Independence is the wrong word. Her complementary role, the female nurturing role, religious role, educational role, and so on within the court. So you get the two boys then, Edward, Prince of Wales, sent off to Ludlow with his own separate household to be trained fully in the arts of kingship as prince, and the Duke of York, Richard Duke of York, the younger son, kept at court with his mother. And I imagine in terms of the educational pattern it would probably have been pretty much the same, because remember what we think of as the Renaissance in terms of the reformed Latinity and new Latin grammar and that sort of thing had not yet hit England, and only does, by the way, right at the end of Henry VII's reign, really from about 1506 onwards. So the two boys brought up in this different fashion, and of course again there's another precedent which is set with Richard Duke of York. Not only the business of being kept at home, it's actually the title. Remember, we now take absolutely for granted, certainly Prince Andrew does, that the proper title of the second son of the monarch is Duke of York. When Richard was created Duke of York, it is setting a precedent. It's done for the first time. It's because, of course, his grandfather, and briefly I suppose Edward, his father, had been Dukes of York. It's putting the Yorkist title on the map. Before that, the king's second son had not been created Duke of York. The Dukedom of York was a junior royal dukedom, the prime dukedom of the royal house, going right back to the creation of dukedoms in the reign of Edward III, was the Dukedom of Clarence, and that was the traditional title of the second son. And it's only with Richard himself that you get the Dukedom of York being used as the title. So look now what Henry VII does. He follows precisely the precedent set by Edward IV. So Arthur is hardly ever at court, right from the beginning, from his birth at Winchester, when he's brought back to Farnham, and has the house palace castle of the bishops of Winchester. He has to be left there because I think he's not fit to travel. He's probably premature, and certainly very delicate at this few months old. He's left to be brought up first at Farnham and then very quickly shifted to Ludlow, precisely following the precedent of Prince Edward. And similarly, when Henry is born in 1491, you again get the precise similar precedent. He's kept with his mother, who of course is the daughter of Elizabeth Woodville. Presumably, I would imagine, she's the one who can largely explain to her husband, to Henry VII, how things had been done at the Yorkist court, because she, of course, had been one of the great stars of the Yorkist court, as what we would now call the Princess Royal, as the eldest daughter of the monarch. And indeed, for the first reign of Edward IV, that's the period from his seizing of the crown to the re-adoption crisis, she is the eldest royal child, as we've seen. The son only arrives during Edward only arrives during the re-adoption crisis. And similarly, Henry is given that title of Richard he's given the same title, the title of Richard Duke of York. He's created Duke of York, 1494. And again, why, of course? Well, partly following precedent, but also because Perkin Warbeck, the pretender, has usurped that title and has been recognised to hold it in the Netherlands. So, of course, you've got to create Henry as Duke of York in this unusually magnificent ceremony. It's very striking. I think I pointed out before, when eventually Prince Henry, by the way, we shouldn't call him Prince Henry. The title of Prince at this point is reserved absolutely to the Prince of Wales. Henry is known as the Lord Henry, or Henry, as when he's created Duke of York, he's Henry Duke of York. and he is, as I said, his ceremony of the creation of Duke of York is quite unusually magnificent and elaborate, involving a formal entree into London and all the rest of it. Whereas when eventually he succeeds as Prince of Wales after Arthur's death, we know absolutely nothing about the ceremony at all. We barely even know when it takes place. We know no detail whatever. The contrast is extreme. Now, the other point, of course, that Todd is making is about the business of education. Here again, I think it's important to distinguish. I would guess that the type of Latin that, in other words, the rather old-fashioned Floriat Latin that we know Henry is taught by his tutor, is when he's a lad, is exactly the same sort of thing that Henry his father would have required the tutor of his eldest son Bernard André to teach Arthur. The great shift when Skelton, that's Henry's first tutor, who also had this old-fashioned Floriat Latin, when he is sacked after Henry actually becomes Prince of Wales, it's because a new sort of fashion in Latinity has come along. That's the fashion which is associated with Erasmus, and it comes very quickly into the royal circle through that mystery figure who seems to have contacts everywhere, and we're not quite sure why, and indeed may have been one of the sources for how things were done in Yorkist England, Thomas More. So I don't think, in fact, the sense that Henry is given Skelton as his tutor when he's a boy means in any way that he's being given an inferior education. The Latin of André is no better and is no different, and I suspect it's probably worse than the Latin of Skelton. The revolution comes once Henry, with his second lot of tutors, is introduced, now Prince of Wales, now at court, is introduced to this new Erasmian style Latinity, which of course is one of the reasons that he is able to intervene in matters theological in the way that he is. He commands the new instruments of Latin in a way which I don't think any of his predecessors have done really since Henry II, since Henry Beauclerc, as he's often known. Now, also something else, Todd. This pattern of sending the eldest child off to Ludlow or wherever actually continues under Henry VIII himself. We always forget this, but in the 1520s, after the treaties with France, the beginning of the general settlement with France, which eventually, rather to everybody's surprise, paves the way to the Reformation, and the treaties with France and the corresponding settlement by Wolsey of the royal household. We think always of the great ordinances of Eltham, which determine the structure of the king's household, lead to the formalisation of the role of the Privy Chamber and whatever, about which, and indeed the beginnings of the Privy Council, about which I've written endlessly. But also other royal households are settled at the same time. And what is very striking, 1526 onwards, it involves, first of all, recognising Henry's heir at this point, the Princess Mary, and I use that term now correctly, because Mary she's never formally created as Princess of Wales. There's no investiture in the fashion that there was a grand investiture for Prince Arthur, and a much less grand one for Henry for Henry Duke of York when he's made Prince of Wales. But she is recognised as Princess of Wales, and moreover she is sent to Ludlow. Exactly, while she's recognised as heir to the throne. And there is even a spare, which of course is probably not, of course, but Henry's bastard, his child, his son, Henry Fitzroy, by Elizabeth Blunt, who was created Duke of Richmond, and he is sent off to run another one of these regional councils. And as you would guess from his title of Duke of Richmond, he's sent off to Yorkshire and to run a version of the Council of the North, based in York, and indeed it is the core, and again the precedent for what becomes the later Council of the York. And again, he has exactly, Henry has got exactly that same combination of a would-be scholarly education and a knightly education. By the way, he's hopeless of the scholarship, unlike all Henry's children in wedlock, who are all extremely bright. It's clear that Henry Fitzroy, how shall one put this, is more of a sporting lad than an academic one. He finds academic work difficult and tiresome, and is a bit of, frankly, clearly a bit of a scallywag. But again, they're sent off. They're sent off to head regional councils to learn in a regional role, and eventually a monarchical role. Princess of Wales, Duke of Richmond, as it were, Lord Warden of the North, or I can't remember. I will confess, I can't remember whether he's formally given that title, whether Richmond is formally given that title. But you have the regional title, the regional household, and you develop. It is hoped, and clearly Mary does develop, the skills of leadership. And in fact, I think it's very striking, looking at Mary's whole career, that precedent of being sent off to Ludlow, I think, is thoroughly important to her when she's restored in favour, when she is, in a sense, secures her independence with Henry's death, and given that very large endowment of land, mainly from the lands that have been seized from the Howard family in East Anglia, and her own great household at Framlingham. She shows herself a mistress of regional politics. She behaves as, a great lord, as the mistress of many acres and the mistress of many men, and shows that preternatural ability to command. But one point again now needs emphasis in terms of actually educational content. All Henry's children, whatever their status, whatever he feels about them at the time, and of course it fluctuates wildly, Mary, Elizabeth and Edward are given the same kind of high-pressured, cutting-edge, Renaissance multilingual education, in ancient languages and modern languages. I mean, Elizabeth is the outstanding example, but the other two are very able indeed. Elizabeth, with that famous school report on her by Roger Ascham, that her spoken and written English, French, Latin, Spanish, and was it Italian, were all excellent. However, spoken ancient Greek was only moderately good. Dazzling array of tongues. So all Henry's children given the same education, but again, the notion of the wherefores, the actual where they're educated, shifting. And even Edward, although clearly Henry by this point is determined, after having struggled so hard for that son, to keep him very much under his eye, the role of the women, of his daughters, and the relationship to the Queen is very close. With Edward, there comes that moment at age 6, I think it is, when he ceases to be notes in his journal, the beginning of his journal. He ceased to be with the women. He's shifted into a masculine environment. On the other hand, Mary and Elizabeth remain within the orbit of the Queen's, which means for most of the time that's important, they are within the household of Catherine Parr. again, Mary, to her profound fury, had also been put in the household of Anne Boleyn, effectively, as she felt, treated as a servant. But so the girls within the Queen, Edward, after the age of 6 or so, treated now as a young boy and to be brought up by men. So, going back to the fundamental point, theirs is a world of precedence and precedent. They're following ideas of what were the right ways of doing things, and the notion that children, you may love them equally. I think they probably did in their own fashion, but they have different roles and different functions. The heir is one thing, the spares are another, and the daughters are yet another. Because again, within a dynastic view of the world, family relationships are of course also power relationships. That we've sentimentalized the family, they didn't. Family, particularly dynasty, was the prime way in which wealth, kingdoms, everything else was transmitted. No room for sentiment there. So that's a long answer, but again, it's trying to enter imaginatively into their world. What are the values that they have? Which, again, they're different from our values. They're alien, they may be contradictory to our values, but the moment you spell them out, you can see why. These are not monsters. These are people simply responding to different social, political, economic structures. That's all. Human beings responding to different circumstance. And our job as historians is to try and imagine those different worlds, imagine those different values. And of course, it's not a question of just imagining, just reaching them, researching them, discovering them. They are discoverable.